Welcome to StoryTalk, a roundtable discussion of a single story at a time. StoryTalk is a production of the Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit One Week Critique, which provides pedagogical resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about our programs or support our work by visiting oneweekcritique.com. That's the number oneweekcritique.com. I'm al-Sirgany, here as usual with Ingrid Wenzler.
Hi there.
And Matthew Schmidt.
Hello.
And today we'll be discussing Recitatif, one of the few, and I believe the first short story published by the late great Toni Morrison. It first appeared in 1983 in the anthology Confirmation, an anthology of African American women, edited by Amiri and Amina Baraka. The story follows two young girls who've been left by their mothers at St. Bonaventure's, a religious home for orphans. One of the girls is black, the other is white, a fact which, though somewhat amorphous in the story, plays into the challenges the two girls face from their early friendship at St. Bonnie's, as they call it, into their adult lives, as they meet by chance and intention throughout the 60s and 70s, maybe a little into the 80s. Following Matthew's lead of our last discussion about Ann Beatty's Janice, I'm going to be brief in summary and let the discussion take us through the various meetings of the girls, Twyla and Roberta. But before I do, is there any critical sort of baseline information I missed?
I don't think so. I think you pretty well cover it.
Cool. Well, in that case, initially the girls are forced together because they are roommates. This bond develops around understanding as well as fear of the Gargirls, a play on gargoyles, among other things. I wanted to start, rather than end, on the philosophic. Twyla and Roberta, who are of different races, understand each other. They protect each other. What's so significant about that bond and how it emerges? After all, without a feeling of permanent loyalty and connection emerging from that bond, the rest of the story would be no more than a sort of series of chance encounters between two kids who went to school together. So why does that bond matter? What's so important about it?
Well, I mean, I think the main reason for me, I guess, is that they really don't know anybody else.
Yeah.
For one thing. And the story, doesn't come in and tell us, hey, we have friends where our mothers live, for example. But they're 8 years old, right? They're very young, and they are taken from their parents for two different reasons. And they're living in a place that is mostly orphans. So that's a huge difference, right? Actually having a parental figure and, somewhere to actually go home. There's a possibility to leave St. Bonnie's if their mothers figure out their problems. And so there's this divide within the shelter between those orphans and those that have a parent somewhere. And one of the other things is they're thrown directly into the exact same room. There's 4 beds in the room, and there's only 2 of them. Right. So at first, maybe a little bit it's forced, but it kind of happens organically and quickly in that Twyla, who generally the story is told from Twyla's point of view.
Yeah.
She and Roberta have a conversation right at the beginning, and Roberta wants to know if Twyla's mother is also sick, like her mother. And the answer is no, she likes to dance all night, which, in itself is not exactly telling. Much like several things in the story. Like, dancing could mean 2 or 3 different things to me. And, as a metaphor.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that Twyla initially really likes Roberta is that she doesn't ask questions. She She just accepts the information. And in this way is like understanding of the predicament. They're both in the same predicament, albeit their mothers do slightly different things.
Yeah.
But are not able to keep them in the home based on the state, thinking that it's not safe for the girls to be in the home with their mothers. And so because of that, they continue to hang out together throughout their time. I believe it was 4 months or so at the shelter. And, you know, they have to deal with the older girls, the Gar girls, who pick on people who are teenagers often, and, you know, make fun of everyone else. They do their own thing. They smoke. They wear lipstick and, you know, paint their eyebrows on. They listen to the radio. And, you know, the young girls are not really invited to that. In fact, are shunned and made fun of.
Yeah, they're only 8.
They're only 8. And, you know, we're going to talk about Maggie later, but there's an episode with Maggie that the Gar girls begin. Yeah. And so they're trying to, like, make it through this place together. And, you know, I think because of their situation being so similar, right, there's a way of understanding, even if they come from different backgrounds, even if their mothers do different things, right, they have emotionally connected and understood each other insofar as, right, like, this is our situation, we should make the best of it.
Yeah. I think that's a really articulate explanation of some of that. I'm hoping, Ingrid, you've got some specific thoughts about the ways in which the mothers are alike and different, etc., among other notes you might have on that idea.
If you don't mind, can I take us in a slightly different direction?
Yeah.
I think Matthew summarizes that friendship so well. I think to go back to another part of your question that I think is really smart, Morrison's decision to establish this friendship and that bond early on is so crucial to the story she ends up telling. It's a story that's built around this friendship and how it changes over time. So it's really important that we understand the friendship, what it is, how it came to be, and the nuances of it early on, so that, you know, as it changes over time, we understand what to do with that as readers. I think I actually paid attention to a lot of the moments that Matthew's already brought up. So, like, one very early on that I think is so charming is it refers to Roberta and Twyla being placed in the same room. I'm just going to read a little bit because I think it's worth looking at closely. No big long room with 100 beds like Bellevue. There were 4 to a room, and when Roberta and me came, there was a shortage of state kids, so we were the only ones assigned to 406 and could go from bed to bed if we wanted to. And we wanted to, too. We changed beds every night, and for the whole 4 months we were there, we never picked one out as our own permanent bed. Yeah. This reminds me of a Tom Waits song that I really like, Christmas Card for Hooker, because of it's kind of like strange, whimsical notion of like something as small as changing beds or driving a different car every day, depending on how you feel, the line from that song, as being, the kind of a special thing, the kind of thing that could bond you. More importantly here, though, one thing that this story does from the get-go is it sort of establishes what their experience was at St. Bonnie's, and how they're different even from other kids there. So, they aren't orphans, as Adam notes. Like, their mothers are both living, and so they're placed in a separate room together. That's a distinction within the distinction that's already being made. I think, another moment that Matthew rightly pointed to that I'm sure we're going to talk about a lot is Roberta not laughing at Twyla and that being part of their bond.
Yeah.
So let me just point out how that comes about too. Mrs. Itkin, who they call Big Bozo, is introducing them. And she says, Twyla, this is Roberta. Roberta, this is Twyla. Make each other welcome. And what Twyla says is, my mother won't like you putting me in here.
Yeah.
Good, said Bozo. Maybe then she'll come and take you home. So Twyla comments as the narrator, how's that for me? And if Roberta had laughed, I would have killed her, but she didn't. She just walked over to the window and stood with her back to us. Turn around, said Bozo. Don't be rude. Now, Twyla, Roberta. When you hear a loud buzzer, that's the call for dinner. She goes on a little bit. And then Twyla comments, Roberta must have thought I meant that my mother would be mad about my being put in the shelter, not about rooming with her. Because as soon as Bozo left, she came over to me and said, is your mother sick too? No, I said. She just likes to dance all night. Oh, she nodded her head, and I liked the way she understood things so fast. This is a really important part of their bond. It's something that Twyla comes back to a few times, like not laughing or understanding. But I mean, the way that this moment lays is really, really smart and pretty funny, I think, because Twyla goes from, pointing out how Roberta didn't quite understand that moment to quickly saying, I liked the way she understood things so fast. So, I mean, it's actually kind of a misunderstanding that first bonds them. Roberta doesn't laugh partly because she doesn't understand what Twyla is saying, right?
Yeah.
But then, there's this kind of the less you say about it, the better kind of tacit understanding thing that they have going on that also sort of cements that bond. There are other smaller things that Morrison does to characterize this friendship. Twyla loves eating off of Roberta's plate, eating the food that she leaves. But I think another thing that Matthew smartly touches on is bullying and those older girls that are present, them sort of defending themselves against those girls, and also the woman who works in the kitchen, Maggie, falling down. This is something that, especially on first read, is a little quieter in terms of how it relates to the two girls' bonds and, their friendship. But Maggie falling down is something that preoccupies both of them quite a bit in different ways. And, I'm sure that's something we'll look at as well. But I think when I'm looking at their friendship as a whole, those are some of the things I'm seeing, and I think it really is so important that we understand, the ways in which this friendship was very circumstantial, the girls being placed in the same room, them having a similar situation, just kind of being thrust together in the way that young kids sometimes are, but also the kinds of things they did for each other in the moments that the story turns to over time that create a deeper kind of bond.
Yeah, I think that's really compelling, right? One thing I really enjoyed about digging into this, I've read a lot of Morrison. I've never read the short stories until I sat down with Recitatif. And I think she does something really tremendous with perspective, both because Twyla has this at once sort of simple perspective that has all of these really rich details articulated within it, right? Wherein sort of observing a cleaning woman and her like physical deformities being of interest is a very like childish thing to be doing. The fact that that's going to come back within their own lives, it is quietly placed. I think also, right, like the term that keeps coming up early on, right, like beautiful dead parents in the sky, right, like is almost being jealous of people who are orphans in part because of, right, like what Roberta I think understands right away. It's not, I think there is a misunderstanding there, and it's a small misunderstanding, but there's a larger other understanding, something about a parent being not right in a way that doesn't need to be explored by other people or labeled by other people or, pitied by other people, but that does need to be recognized and understood, I think is something that is really critical that Roberta gets right about Twyla and vice versa, right? Like over time, I think I want to make it clear that while the euphemisms are never entirely articulated, that as Matthew noted, right, like Twyla's mother dances all night, which over time I guess means, like prostitution or mania, but I'm leaning toward prostitution in my own image, in part because she never stops dancing, despite the fact that the girls get much, much older throughout the story, and Roberta's mother significantly, we're going to get a little more directly that she's unwell, but she's unwell mentally, and she's being institutionalized. I would gather that might be a kind of side note that the two of you would or wouldn't agree with, but
I mean, I think the thing about the dancing and the sickness are that they're not explained. That's the thing. You can, I think, draw, like I said, your own conclusions of what that might mean. I could as easily see being sick as being drug addicted. Yeah. Because one of the things that Roberta's mother does is wear a huge cross that Twyla in the notes claims that is 6 by 6 inches.
Yeah, I love that image too. It's so wild.
And she carries a Bible with her at all times. Yeah. So, that could also be someone trying to get well, physically too. Yeah. But that's not exactly the point. I think one thing is that they land in a situation they don't understand. Yeah. They're 8 years old. Twyla's trying to remember what happened when she was 8 years old. Yeah. And it's the weird things that stick out for her. One of the things that comes in twice are the socks that Roberta wears to the day their mothers both visit. Right? She washes the socks the night before and tries to dry them, but they're not dry, and she wears them anyway because they're beautiful. And that comes back around later in one of Twyla's memories. But it's the things that stick out are what make it in here. And so it doesn't matter exactly what the mothers are up to, so much as that they don't have the same problems. And thus, when they do meet and Roberta tries to introduce them, Roberta's mother takes Roberta and goes to the back of the line to get away from Twyla and her mother Mary, because Mary is looking pretty, junky, or whatever you want to call it. She's wearing, quote, a ratty fur jacket and some green slacks that Twyla hates because it makes her mother's behind stick out a little, right? And so I think another thing about their mothers coming that separates them from the other orphans is that they know more about them now. And right, it's that thing where when you're in some sort of general population, the more people know about you, like the less you can hide.
Yeah.
And it's like at one point, right when Mary sees Twyla, she says, "Twyla, baby, Twyla, baby."
Yeah.
Right? And like Twyla already knows that is not good for her because the Gargoyles are gonna say Twyla, baby, like all the time, every time they see her, because now they know her mother and what her mother's like, and they're gonna hold it against her.
And they do.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So the other thing I wanted to mention about that early stuff before we move on to the sort of like resonance narratives of the story is that, of course, neither of the girls is good in school, right? And they are, at one time, Twyla describes them as the only two without beautiful dead parents in the sky. So the only two who aren't actual orphans, they're just being left there. But they also, the bozo is a little mean to them about their like academic inadequacies, as she sees that. And that, I think, like, on one hand, right, like, I think Morrison's, she gets children more right than most people who write children. She also gets homeless shelters more right than maybe anyone I've seen who hasn't worked in one. And, you know, I think it's important that those, these are not dumb kids, right? They are kids who have a lot going on, and that's a lot of what we're going to work through in the rest of the story. They do get separated after 4 months. And the first time they meet again, it says young adults. Twyla's working in Howard Johnson's diner. Roberta comes into that diner right around the time that Twyla is finishing up her shift. She's working a sort of overnight shift, so it's fairly early in the morning. And Roberta's traveling with some musicians, one of whom is supposedly going to the coast to play with Jimi Hendrix. Twyla's never heard of Jimi, which makes the encounter really awkward and embarrassing in a way that I think of as a little infantile. But I think this particular moment sort of, you know, befits an age, both of the women and of the zeitgeist, which now we're talking sometime late 60s, early 70s.
Oh, late 60s. Hendrix died in 70.
Right, fair enough. Way to have a weird factoid ready for us. And, you know, I think it also foreshadows the kind of craggy relationship the girls are going to have throughout the rest of the story, right? For that reason, I'm hoping we can look at this section not only as the series of plot events that it is, right? But in terms of the way that it underpins the narratives on either side of it, the way we're going to look forward and back to read Twyla and Roberta. So can we break down this narrative, sort of what happens here, how it's achieved, and how that creates that forward-backward line?
Yeah, totally. Let me jump in and read how we enter into this section. I was working behind the counter at the Howard Johnson's on the Thruway just before the Kingston exit. Not a bad job. Kind of a long ride from Newberg. But okay once I got there. Mine was the second shift, 11 to 7. Very light until a Greyhound checked in for breakfast at around 6:30. At that hour, the sun was all the way clear of the hills behind the restaurant. The place looked better at night, more like shelter, but I loved it when the sun broke in. Even if it did show all the cracks in the vinyl and the speckled floor looked dirty no matter what the mop boy did. Morrison is so careful here, even just in establishing the scene, you know, I mean, you think about writing short fiction and the times where that you end up using something descriptive for the visual element, but you don't end up putting it to work per se. What I love about this is, you know, we get to see Twyla responding to the place, how she loves it when the sun broke in at the beginning of this scene, and we come back to it at the end. The way this scene concludes is Howard Johnson's really was a dump in sunlight. So, I mean, you have that level of attention to detail. In terms of what actually happens, Twyla recognizes Roberta and is eager to see her. This friendship has been important to her, and she does have questions even as she's anticipating the encounter about how it's going to go, as many of us would. She wonders if Roberta will remember her. She wonders if she'll want to remember her, but she's generally eager and excited to see her friend after so many years. And I think you're right that the embarrassment does have this kind of childish quality to it, in terms of how Twyla reacts, but also just what's at stake here, and the way that they're talking to each other and the way that the encounter happens. It could be set in middle school, in terms of you don't know Jimi Hendrix, it's like a little bit of a middle school jibe finally, but because of how much time we spend with that friendship early on in the story, I think when we come to this section, we see the ways in which these young girls are good to each other, the ways in which they know when to be quiet about each other's mothers and when to stick up for each other. A moment like this is kind of crushing. Not that those middle school moments aren't in their own way, but, I think it feels, because of where it's placed, differently loaded. And there are moments that really carefully call to earlier moments in the story, the laugh is a big deal here. So even before it becomes clear that Twyla doesn't know Jimi Hendrix, before they have that little encounter, Roberta's already laughing at her for being in Newberg. She laughed then, a private laugh that included the guys, but only the guys, and they laughed with her. What could I do but laugh too, and wonder why I was standing there with my knees showing out from under that uniform? Without looking, I could see the blue and white triangle on my head, my hair shapeless in a net, my ankles thick in white Oxford. So, she quickly goes from eager to see her friend to shamed. She's ashamed of how she looks, of where she is. And she's no longer included in that laugh. There is a laugh at all, and that's a big deal. I think reaching forward, you asked a little bit about how this moment touches on the content that comes before and the content after. And there's a moment in a later scene where, in this one, Twyla is busy with her shift at Howard Johnson's, and she's waiting for her replacement. And the whole time she's kind of looking around to see if Roberta and her friends have left, because she doesn't want to miss them. And in a later scene, one that comes after this, when they run into each other in a food emporium, Twyla has to say about herself that she kept herself from glancing around to check Roberta's progress. You see that later check. I'm babbling a little bit, but I wanted to point to some of the moments where the story is very, very carefully pointing to moments that come before it and moments afterward, and how, because of that friendship being established so strongly early on, we come to this moment and it feels kind of like a blow.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I don't think Twyla is prepared to accidentally run into Roberta, especially where she works. And one way it points backward is that Roberta's in a booth smoking a cigarette with two guys, quote, smothered in head and facial hair.
I love that description, too.
Indeed.
It goes on. Her own hair was so big and wild I could hardly see her face, but the eyes, I would know them anywhere. She had on a powder blue halter and shorts outfit and earrings the size of bracelets. Talk about lipstick and eyebrow pencil. She made the big girls look like nuns. Right, so clearly Twyla is connecting Roberta directly to the Gargoyles.
Right.
Also, possibly, Twyla learned how to do all of this from imitating the Gargoyles. And now she's older and, a teenager or early 20s, maybe. I don't know exactly how old they are at this point.
Yeah.
Probably a teenager would be my guess based on the Hendricks, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think they're somewhere in that.
But anyway, she still wants to connect with her because, who else does she have to talk to? She doesn't have anybody else to talk to. She goes out of her way to tell us, the reader, quote, I know I never talked about it to anybody.
Yeah.
Right? And maybe Roberta hasn't either because, the first thing you do when you meet people is you want to impress them to be your friends, right? If you like them.
Yeah.
And so you're not going to pull out, oh, hey, I was in a shelter, because unless the other person does first, right?
Yeah.
And, Twyla also talks about the Howard Johnsons as being shelter-like. And again, they're meeting in a space that is a shelter from the road, right? So Roberta's on a Greyhound going from one place to another. She might not have a fixed place. Later, we'll learn that she did run away from the shelter when she was 14. And so she probably doesn't have a fixed residence or something like that at this point and is trying to figure her life out.
Yeah.
And Twyla is working kind of an entry-level type job, if you want to call it that. I don't know that that's a fair way to call it, but the way it is, it's kind of an entry-level job.
Yeah. It's blue collar and easy to get.
Right. And so, the girls are still trying to figure themselves out and what to do with their lives. And yet, that bond remains because they both know a crucial point from each other's past that they probably hide. And thus, Twyla decides that she's going to, try to talk to her. Of course, Roberta's kind of in the midst of her own journey. And because she's with friends, she kind of wants to show her coolness. And thus doesn't want to really talk about where they met, how they know each other. And really all she can do is say, wow. She says wow multiple times. As Ingrid has pointed out, right, she laughs this person off who doesn't know Hendricks. And also I really love how Morrison ends this. What eventually happens is, because Twyla's put off by Roberta, Twyla goes for the kill, so to speak, by asking how her mother is.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that just destroys this whole, explodes the situation, so to speak. And, she says, quote, how's your mother? I asked. Her grin cracked her whole face. She swallowed. Fine, she said. How's yours? Pretty as a picture, I said, and turned away. The backs of my knees were damp. Howard Johnson's really was a dump in the sunlight. And poetically speaking, the damp and the dump equate Howard Johnson's and Twyla.
Yeah.
And that's amazing.
Yeah.
We just change a vowel, and boom, that's taken care of. and like this particular encounter where they are at odds because of the situation really speaks to like what's going to happen. Is that, you know, the next time they meet, Roberta kind of somehow like elides this particular encounter,
Yeah.
and is like really friendly the next time they meet in a supermarket. And you know, it's something that Twyla has a hard time reconciling with her last interaction with Roberta. And this becomes kind of like the linchpin that they go back and forth on, like who they are, what happened to them, and why they can't, you know, get along in the way that it seemed like they might have gotten along after their 4 months together at St. Bobby's.
Yeah, I think that's really brilliantly stated, in part because I think it's still going back and sort of explaining that first big question that I was trying to ask about what's significant about 4 months in your life at the age of 8, right? Like, you asked me about what were you doing between the like months of, you know, December and, you know, April, like of, you know, the year you turned 8. I couldn't tell you, but there is something about childhood that sometimes encountering a friend or encountering something in particular, having a traumatic moment or a not so traumatic moment, right? Like significantly to what Ingrid already read this line, I believe, but like significant to not wanting to tell people, as you know, right? Like the third sentence in the story is people want to put their arms around you when you tell them you were in a shelter, but it really wasn't bad. And I think there's something, right? Like it may not have been bad, but it was significant and brought these two girls together in a way that is, you know, permanently, I don't want to say damaging, I want to say, right, like moving. It's directed them in certain ways, and the ways that they think about lots of different kinds of things, including each other, including, right, like one reason I come to sort of conclusion, rightly or wrongly, about, you know, mental illness with Roberta's mother. I think that it doesn't matter to the story ultimately. I think it is one of the things I put into the equation of why on earth is Roberta, as you put it, eliding the whole, like, the kind of dismissal of that first situation. Why does she flip-flop, and why does she lie, and why does she sort of gaslight Twyla? And then of course I have to go through and say, like, okay, but also Twyla is the teller of this tale, presumably after all of this has already happened. And so I'm taking it on her account, although I do find Twyla to be relatively reliable, in part because she reacts exactly as I would expect someone who's being a little gaslit to react, right? She has these moments of kind of welling up of anger and like irrational behavior, and then like apologetic guilt. You know, I've been reading quite a bit about this story, and I have over time, right? Like, my friend Monica Prince recommended this story to me a decade ago, and I just hadn't gotten around to it. It was on a list I found. And, you know, I've been looking at a lot of sort of ancillary material, and a lot of the conversation about the story focuses on Morrison's particular choice to identify Roberta and Twyla specifically as being of different races, but not to identify which one of the two is black and which one is white. There are moments where, you know, we see sort of direct racial aggression, right? You know, Mary, Twyla's mother, commenting on them not washing their hair, for instance, but we don't get, mostly I think it's, you know, it's a story about microaggressions more than anything, right? But to my mind, the choice to sort of not specify race, among other things, draws attention also to the ways in which all of those things, that race gets involved in matters of class mobility and relative status, and how in a time like the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, a lot of that's changing and potentials are changing, right? I think nowhere in the story is that more like remarkably rendered or more significant than in the section when Twyla and Roberta meet for the second time. The sentences, the choices to outline the developing sort of financial positions and how finances shape their own ideas about their lives are really exquisite to me. So I'm hoping we can look at that section, its sort of thrust, some of the sentences in particular, and how the girls who are now fully grown women with husbands and families of their own almost become friends, but also continue to negotiate these memories of that very specific time, being 8, right?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that happens is we get an opening long description of Newberg from Twyla. And the opening sentence is actually really telling. It is, quote, "James is as comfortable as a house slipper." Right? Like, it's funny, but like we know automatically, like, she married James because it was comfortable.
Yeah, not because she's like in love with him.
Right, she's not in love with him.
It's so rough.
She just needed some comfort and like stability.
Yeah.
And like, James is a good man, he's a fireman, and he has a large family, and she likes the large family.
Yeah.
It's like all of a sudden I've acquired all these people that I can rely on and that I can talk with, and like, it is comfortable. And even though I don't really know Newberg the way that this family knows Newberg, they call different places by their old names based on like who used to own a specific place.
Yeah.
A&Ps they call Rico's because a Mr. Rico used to own a mom and pop store there.
Yeah.
The community college is Town Hall because it once was Town Hall, right? And so she's moved into this kind of different world that maybe she doesn't completely understand but is comfortable. And she ends up having a son with James. We learn that here. Even though that particular family is kind of stuck in the olden days, so to speak, as the story puts it, when, all of these places were different things. And, one of the things it tells us is that half the population of Newberg is on welfare now, right? But to my husband's family, it was still some upstate paradise of a time long past. And so things are quickly changing from what that family she married into is used to. One of those big changes is that IBM is there, it's growing, and a lot of, quote, smart IBM people and, quote, rich IBM crowd like are moving into the suburbs around the city. And this ends up being how she runs into Roberta, is that in the mail they get a brochure for this opening of a new food emporium, and she just goes over there kind of to check it out.
Yeah.
She just wants to see how the other half, so to speak, is living, because everything is more expensive. They have a wider selection of different things, and she goes there and puts things in her cart to buy that she knows, quote, would sit in my cupboard for years. And the one thing she buys is these Klondike bars that
Nice, dude.
she doesn't feel guilty about, because she knows, her father-in-law and her son love these Klondike bars. They will be eaten quickly. And so like, that's the one thing. And so when she meets Roberta in the checkout, and Roberta eventually asks her to coffee, Like her main worry this whole time is the Klondike bars melting because it's summer. And all of the other things are expendable in the way that like that money was spent and, you know, it was foolish and she reprimands herself, but like she really does not want to lose the Klondike bars.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the meeting between them is really interesting in that Roberta's the one this time that calls out for Twyla. And Twyla, kind of stunned, looks at this woman, and I'll read this little section here. The classical music piped over the aisles had affected me, and the woman leaning toward me was dressed to kill. Diamonds on her head, a smart white summer dress. "I'm Mrs. Benson," I said. "Ho ho, the big bozo," she sang. For a split second, I didn't know what she was talking about. She had a bunch of asparagus and 2 cartons of fancy water. "Roberta." "Right. For heaven's sake, Roberta." "You look great," she said. Right? And then they start talking about where they live and who they married and their children and stuff. But, you know, Twyla is not expecting to be recognized in this place. And especially not by someone this well-to-do.
Yeah.
And one of the words that keeps coming up in this story is kill.
Yeah.
At the beginning, right, Ingrid pointed out the spot where when they first meet, had Roberta asked more questions about her mother's dancing, she would have, quote, killed her.
Yeah.
She talks about killing her mother twice early on because of how she acts, what she wears, those types of things, right? And again, here's dressed to kill. And like, so there's always this violence right on the edge of their relationship throughout the story. And like, in this one in particular, right, they compare what they have going for themselves, right? And Twyla's got a limousine with a driver. Roberta has a limousine with a driver, and multiple help at home.
Twyla calls them servants. But
Servants.
She kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Helps them.
they're paying people to work for them in the home and drive a car for them. And, you know, one of the questions that Roberta asked Twyla is about her husband and if he's nice. And, like, she presses that issue. And, you know, Twyla kind of comes back and says, "He's wonderful, Roberta, wonderful." You know, like, in a way that we know is not exactly true, based on the comfort that we discussed earlier. I've been going on for a while now, so I'm going to toss it over to Ingrid.
Yeah, I think all that you've observed around class is, you know, sharp, astute, all those good words. I think the moment that we've just stopped on is a key one for me, actually, when Roberta is asking Twyla about her husband. The line is, Roberta's eyes were steady, as though she really meant the question and wanted an answer. For me, that moment links back to the Jimi Hendrix scene and to some of the ways in which Twyla's still bringing that scene, carrying it forward into that moment. She doesn't expect Roberta to be asking a question and to really want to know the answer. She is still skeptical and cautious in this encounter. And, you know, I mean, I think, Matthew, you're so right that there's a violence that seems to kind of run under, like an undercurrent, I guess, is the simple word for what I'm thinking of. But, you know, I mean, there's this violent undercurrent that runs through many of these scenes where you're kind of watching these girls interact in the moments where they bond, but also kind of waiting for them to come apart, or to surprise and to see them come together in a moment where you expect them to be more cautious or reserved. I think when it comes to class, as with race, the portrait is really sophisticated. I really love how we see Newberg through Twyla's eyes, and we see the ways in which her husband James's family has sort of romanticized the space. Their way of relating to it is as a paradise, but that it's not that anymore, that most people are on welfare. At the same time, we get the detail that her mother-in-law puts up jelly and cucumbers and buys butters wrapped in cloth from a dairy. So, the family is sort of carrying forward, certain traditions. And, I think what Morrison achieves there is we trust Twyla's judgment more. We get to see the specific ways in which the family is carrying out these traditions. But we also see her say, they're romanticizing this. It's not quite that way. But, it's unclear what her relationship is to it. She sees that it's not quite that way. She's going to check out the food emporium. She understands what that is in the space. And that it isn't a space that people in her class are going to use very much. But she's checking it all out for herself. I want to look at another moment in this scene. It's right after they get outside of the food emporium, and Twyla's preoccupied about her Klondikes, and she sees the dark blue limousine. She misunderstands that the driver isn't Roberta's husband. And then Twyla comments, "Oh my, if the big bozo could see you now." And in this moment, we both giggled, really giggled. Suddenly, in just a pulse beat, 20 years disappeared, and all of it came rushing back. The big girls, whom we called gargirls, Roberta's misheard word for the evil stone faces described in civics class. There, dancing in the orchard, the ploppy mashed potatoes, the double weenies, the Spam with pineapple. We went into the coffee shop holding on to one another, and I tried to think why we were glad to see each other this time and not before. Once, 12 years ago, we passed like strangers, a black girl and a white girl meeting in a Howard Johnson's on the road and having nothing to say. One in a blue and white triangle waitress hat, the other on her way to see Hendrix. Now we were behaving like sisters, separated for much too long. Those 4 short months were nothing in time. Maybe it was the thing itself, just being there together. 2 little girls who knew what nobody else in the world knew how. Not to ask questions. How to believe what had to be believed. There was politeness in that reluctance and generosity as well. I'll stop there. I think this moment, we get to see how they move from encountering each other so tentatively, from asking each other these questions, from Roberta's, unexpected warmth here and Twyla's reluctance to just getting to this moment that feels so real, where they just begin to laugh about it all and reminisce. And the way in which Morrison then shifts from scene to Twyla's perspective and, her thoughts around all of this. The things she doesn't understand about it. What was it about this moment and not the last one? I think this is one moment in a long story, but this is kind of the constant move where within these encounters and re-encounters, we get them kind of coming up against each other, not quite understanding what's working and what's not. And but we do get these really smart thoughts from Twyla, questions about, the mystery of seeing friends and growing up with them and changing together through time.
Yeah, I think that one thing that really I find remarkable about this section, and one of the reasons it sort of like is the centerpiece of Breaking My Heart in that story, is that specific moment that you identify wherein Twyla recognizes the horse shit of all of it. And that like their specific bond is not asking questions, while nevertheless Twyla is so aware, at least on a sort of like meniscus level of things, that things aren't what everyone else is pretending they are, right? She knows that Roberta has misheard Gargoyles, right? But she also knows that like the music is in the grocery store is some nouveau riche like crap, right? Like no one's sitting there going like, oh man, Tchaikovsky and grapes are on sale at the same time, you know what I mean? And I think that, right, like even, right, like the 70s or 80s, right, like taking a limousine to the grocery store is a ridiculous notion, even for like people who have money, right? It's especially in a town that's being sort of gentrified in the way that like it's being described as being gentrified. And I think there's something really powerful and sad about all of those realizations, that all of this is pretend, and somehow that limousine is not more significant than early on one thing that really touches me, right? Like I have a friend who is really hung up on what he calls poverty mentality, and he's always sort of referencing our childhood as if that were like traumatic in some way to not be middle class, because you then spend the rest of your life expecting that you need to get up to what middle class people have and judging by their standards. I think Twyla disproves and proves that point on some level by recognizing, like, both feeling the guilt about buying stuff that she won't eat immediately, that won't get eaten immediately, but also by knowing that there's something sort of ridiculous about the whole space and the image of the space, and by questioning things that other people aren't entirely questioning, which she does throughout, right? Like, she doubts in the previous section, or well, in this section, in a conversation about the previous section about Roberta, thinking that when they were at Howard Johnson's, that was a time when black and white people didn't mix, whereas Twyla remembers that as being the time black and white people mixed, right? That she doesn't take things at face value, and I think that's remarkable. I think in that way there are, right, there's the time that those two girls have at St. Bonnie's, which underpins the entire relationship, and then there are these two encounters, one at Howard Johnson's, one at the grocery store, where they see each other again. In fact, there are several times in the story that the women are going to meet, but for me there's sort of St. Bonnie's, then encounter one, encounter two, and then there's the rest of the story, because it takes off in a more I don't know, sweeping way. I think that the thread feels more intertwined thereafter, which isn't for me about section breaks so much as the way it moves. So I'm hoping that the two of you can help me think out why I think of it that way, or disagree with me entirely and say like, no, in fact there are several sections that come hereafter, and let's talk about how they get there.
Before we change gears, this is such a long, sweeping story, and we don't have to, of course, like cover every moment within it. But I've been thinking about class and what we did and what we have and haven't covered there, and I think a really important moment with regard to class in this story has to do with when both of the girls' moms come to visit. And I just wanted to quickly mention something that happens there. I do see it as a moment that kind of calls to the earlier bond and how it was formed, like the early moment where I point to Roberta not laughing is a little bit funny in the way that it lays, but we get in scene, a much more dramatic example of Roberta's ability to not say anything and have that actually be a very powerful and kind thing for a child to do. So when their two mothers come to visit, the two girls are both looking forward to it, as Matthew mentioned. Roberta's busily drying her beautifully scalloped socks, washing them, drying them, wearing them wet anyway. They've both made little paper Easter baskets. They're eager about this, and they want their mothers to meet. And when they do meet, Roberta's mother won't shake Twyla's mother's hand. Mary, simple-minded as ever, grinned and tried to yank her hand out of the pocket with the raggedy lining to shake hands, I guess. Roberta's mother looked down at me and looked down at Mary, too. She didn't say anything, just grabbed Roberta with her Bible-free hand and stepped out of line, walking quickly to the rear of it. Mary was still grinning because she was not too swift when it comes to what's really going on. Then this light bulb goes off in her head and she says, "That bitch," really loud, and us almost in the chapel now, organ music whining, the Bonnie angels singing sweetly. Everybody in the world turned around to look, and Mary would have kept it up, kept calling names if I hadn't squeezed her hand as hard as I could. So there's this moment, but Roberta Twyla's mother doesn't bring any food for them, and Twyla's looking over at the wonderful spread that Roberta's mother has brought, and feeling really ashamed of what her mother's worn and how her mother's behaved. And Roberta afterward, brings over some of that food to share. And food is actually really important to Twyla as a character. Her preoccupation with the Klondike bars isn't just a class thing. She's someone who cares about food and describes herself as wanting to be a waitress because she wants to match food up with the right people. So I just wanted to go back to that moment because I think as this friendship kind of comes apart and as we do get Twyla's really sort of razor sharp insights into what is and isn't accurate, I think, Adam, to your point, she's a character who in places comes off as a little bit simple, and I think some of that is because of what Morrison is doing with perspective. She's at once kind of speaking 8-year-old language as she moves through this and moving forward, but she's not insisting on the present moment in the retrospective very much. We don't see how old Twyla is when she's telling this story, so I think that dance in terms of perspective sometimes makes Twyla seem like she is a little bit simple or doesn't have the whole story about things, but she actually, the more you look at her, is a tremendously wise and insightful character who, is really thinking things through and understanding when she doesn't know exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
Which, admitting that you don't know what's going on is sometimes the best you can do.
Oh, I think it's a total sign of maturity. It's also, I think, she has an incredible, Twyla has through Morrison's eyes, has an incredible perspective on her own childhood. One thing about food is that Twyla notes that the mashed potatoes and hot dogs are like Thanksgiving for her because her mother's idea of like a dinner is popcorn, right?
And Yoo-hoo.
Yeah, a can of Yoo-hoo.
God help her.
But, right, like, not nutritional, but not, I think she recognizes that for her that just was fine. And I think that's, but it's also part of the bond that food is a resource that she wants, that like whatever Roberta's experiences are, she can be picky, and Twyla's just happy to have food. And maybe that's why I see that divide in the story a little bit, that a lot of that divide is built around the early stories about two girls being thrown together, and then the kind of jumble of things that tosses them back and forth apart. And then what happens in that, what I'm calling the second set of the story, is really about the two women being thrown together as their children are being thrown together, this time through the conscious decision on the part of the city of Newberg to start busing students in order to racially miscegenate the schools. Maybe in that way I'm looking for a mirror out of that, or I see a mirror out of that. Would the two of you agree?
I don't know about a mirror.
Yeah, that's fine.
I guess I don't see it necessarily as a mirror, so to speak. I think when you're talking about, you had said earlier, the last two sections somehow are more intertwining than the earlier ones, or at least you took it that way.
Well, I think what I mean is there's sort of a breaking line for me between the first three sections and then the last two sections.
Okay, let me speak to that right now.
Yeah.
I think the reason is because of section 3. Section 3, where they meet in the grocery store and then have coffee, brings in kind of the crux of the story, and it's also the longest section.
Yeah.
However, it passes quickly because a lot of it's dialogue.
Yeah.
The first section is heavy on, composition and not a lot of dialogue. The second section is very short. The third section very long but passes quickly. Once we get to the school busing issues, a lot of big paragraphs, and then the final section is really like a page and a half, maybe 2 pages, where they meet briefly. And I think when you read it the first time and you don't know that Maggie is like a centerpiece in this,
Yeah.
it's pretty brilliant because, in the first section when they talk about Maggie, it's more like they're talking about her from the perspective of children, and they don't really pay like attention to, or at least the story doesn't pay attention to this as being a pivotal point.
So we haven't actually laid this out as to what happens with Maggie. Would you mind breaking that down for everyone listening? Yeah.
Well,
It's all on you, Matthew.
oh boy. So in the beginning of the story, the first section, there's talk about how Maggie fell down once in the orchard,
Right.
which is the gargoyle's position.
Okay.
And at that time, Twyla and Roberta were interested in Maggie insofar as Maggie didn't talk, right? So they're interested in her muteness, and they also are trying to find out whether she can hear, because they do call her names at one point. And Twyla is specifically interested in the way she walks, because her legs kind of seem like ellipses, or not ellipses, but like parentheses. And so, like, as children, they're this is something out of the ordinary, even at the shelter. And Maggie is, I believe they call her the kitchen girl. And so there's a little episode in the beginning, but it's a small episode. It doesn't stand out like a large amount. And then this third section really opens that up because Roberta, well, actually, it's Twyla that brings up Maggie because they're talking about the servants that Roberta has. And this, like, they're almost friends at this point, except that, right, Twyla is very aware that Roberta is rich and has servants. And so she's kind of like trying to make Roberta think about servants and how they're treated. And she asks Roberta at one point whether she can read. Roberta demonstrates. Happy, happy, joy, joy in the story. But like, not really, because Twyla's trying to insert herself as like some sort of equal, like mentally, at least superior or equal to Roberta, even if she's not as rich as Roberta. And because Roberta understands she's doing that, she makes up a story about Maggie. It's half true and half not true. To the point that Maggie, in Twyla's eyes, fell down the day that they're talking about, and Roberta says no, she was pushed down, and the girls tore her clothes, the older girls, and Roberta claims that both Twyla and herself kicked Maggie while she was down, and so this really throws Twyla off because she doesn't recall it that way. She's almost positive it didn't happen that way. There's also the fact that at one point in the story, Maggie is called sandy colored. And in this section, Roberta specifically says, no, Maggie is black.
Right.
And so, right, we have race, we have violence, we have memory, and all of this, like, right on the verge of them becoming friends. This comes back in and separates them completely. And so I guess that's what I mean when I say, like, it doesn't feel like a mirror to me, like sections 2 and 4, so to speak, because I think they're very different. And while the particular sections have similar attributes, I think, right? They're about bigger things in the 4th section, in that the maturity of the two women at this point has moved up, and yet it still like lingers in that very strange area where it doesn't seem like they both clearly understand what's happening.
Right.
And yet Roberta at this point is picketing the busing situation, the school situation. And because Roberta's doing that, then Twyla has to do it against her.
Yeah.
And so that continues, right? This, like, the girls and now the women, like, facing off. And yet, I think at this point, it's more like a grudge than it is like them trying to like find a common ground. Especially from Twyla's viewpoint, because like the signs that she makes for this are ridiculous signs that really don't have anything to do with the actual protest, but only putting Roberta's sign down.
Yeah.
And so, again, in the 4th section, we've lost Maggie, so to speak.
Yeah.
In that she doesn't really appear in the 4th section, but it is, while she doesn't appear physically really, Like, she's the thing that's like making Twyla kind of undercut everything Roberta's doing because of this disagreement about what actually happened, who was doing what, who was a bigot, right? And if they've always been like this, right. And if nothing can change.
Yeah.
And like that's the question, I think, or one of the questions that the story is asking, like, right, we don't know who is who. We don't know who's white and we don't know who's black.
Yeah.
And yet they continue to fight based on like what's happening in the world, based on what their impressions of certain situations were, based on past actions against Maggie or not against Maggie. Yeah. And like it's asking this big question is like, you know, why is this, you know, such a big deal? And, you know, obviously it's a huge deal, but the story purposefully, you know, pits two girls and then two women who are not like, who were not completely sure exactly who they are. And the women themselves aren't certain exactly who they are, I don't think.
Yeah.
So that when we come back to Maggie at the end, you know, it's a very brief encounter on Christmas Eve, and Roberta sees Twyla, and at this point Twyla's exasperated. She just wants to move on with her life and not think about this, the Maggie thing or their past antics against each other. And yet Roberta has to apologize for making up the part that they both kicked Maggie.
Yeah.
Because she doesn't want that on Twyla's conscience. And, you know, one of the things she says, Roberta says at the end of the moment is, you know, what the hell happened to Maggie? And, you know, that's where the story ends. And that, like, because of its placement, it changes the whole story that you were kind of maybe thinking you read in a certain respect. Because you have to go back and pay attention to those moments much more clearly to think about exactly how it all operated within the story and your understanding of the story. Because it changes your understanding of the story. I think it's hard for me to get all of my thoughts in there, and I feel like, you know, I could easily detract a few of those at any moment.
Yeah.
But that's me trying to like summarize them.
No, I think that's actually really, really well put, and really, I mean, if you could summarize your thoughts about a story, I think this is I'm thinking of it as a secretly dense story because it doesn't read like it's, you know, it doesn't read like Saul Bellow reads or like Nabokov reads, but I think it is so full of ideas, and it articulates these complexities of, you know, I mean, first and most importantly, just the human connection between two girls who become two women living the world, but as you know, also the ways in which they're like very legitimate feelings about something complex, right? Like whether it's just a small like slight about class issues, or whether it's about Roberta slipping into something like bipolarism or some combination of both, and the two of them not knowing how to deal with that, leads to these ridiculous, sometimes sort of darkly funny, but usually just mostly tragic moments about, you know, where they're blaming each other for like racial iniquities that maybe as children they weren't capable of seeing, or they hadn't fully formulated in their own heads in a way that they are starting to formulate, right? Like Twyla says that thing about it's so easy for them when she sees the Roberta's limousine.
Well, and that's the pronoun. The them is never actually defined.
Yeah. But then you get the two of them marching in line, right? Like I do love, I like laughed out loud reading like Twyla's signs, right? Like Roberta writes like mothers have rights on her anti-busing signs. For whatever reason, she's anti-busing, but Twyla writes, and so do kids, or so do children, or something, right? So they're marching and they don't make sense, and Twyla knows that, but it's still there, which is so upsetting, and even as it's ridiculous to watch, right? Like it's the kind of thing that you would drive by and laugh at because it was so stupid, but like seeing the context in which it emerges makes it both real and comprehensible and like fucking sad, you know. But Ingrid, we've kind of dominated the conversation around Maggie and that later half of the story. Do you have some thoughts about those things that you want to share and how that sort of the developing stories around Maggie change your thinking around the earlier story and how they change your thinking around developing?
Yes, and you haven't dominated. I think it's a dense story. I think we're all just trying to cover the ground that we cover. You know, I'm glad you asked this question about structure, because I think reading this story twice isn't enough. I'd love to read it, you know, many more times, because I'm still in this conversation seeing so many new things about it. I think I did experience it in these sections that we're talking about, and I didn't at the same time. And, you know, as I'm sitting here thinking about things, Adam, I think you're right about some mirroring, and I think you're also right to group those last two sections together, or, I mean, maybe right isn't the word, but I experienced it that way too. I experienced it both ways. So let me try to explain myself. I experienced the second, third, and fourth sections as sort of grouped together and mirroring each other in slight ways. Mm-hmm. So those are the Jimi Hendrix rebuff, the Food Emporium section, and then the busing section, because all of those have these moments where, you know, the girls come together, they're talking, there are moments where, you know, one or the other is anticipating bonding, but where things devolve. And 3 and 4 do both involve Maggie in different ways. 3 is pretty heavy on Maggie, and we start to see her as a concern and, you know, a shared memory that the girls have different perspectives on. And 4 is the busing section. I think Matthew describes so well, is largely out of focus. It's really hard to understand the specifics of the issue are, because we're in Twyla's perspective, and she notes that she doesn't really understand what's going on. Morrison artfully also is playing with, you know, not tagging the characters in terms of race, and yeah, like almost playing games with race. You know, describing one girl in a way that plays to stereotypes and kind of throws us off the scent if we're trying to puzzle out which is which. And, you know, I mean, that's so much of the point of this story that, you know, it doesn't matter, but it does, in that, you know, there are cultural constructs and ways in which we're made to think about race. So, I mean, that section is a confusing one to move through, because it's so much actually about their personal relationship and not about busing, and we're kind of, you know, confused about what's going on there. But, you know, Maggie comes to the surface again as an extreme source of friction between the girls, and, you know, it's clearly something that is finally on both of the girls' minds. I think, Matthew, you're right to describe Twyla as like kind of being over it in that final scene. You know, she's got her Christmas tree that she's decided on last minute and is kind of just trying to move through her day and get home. And Roberta's carrying this guilt about what may be mental illness. I for some reason did think that her mother was mentally ill as well. There was something that put me on that scent. I can't remember
There's
what
a brief
now.
mention that also her grandmother was institutionalized, which is usually
Yeah.
euphemistic of mental illness.
But not always.
Not always.
Yeah,
Notably. Notably.
I mean, I think a lot is out of focus in that way, and it makes this story so much stronger because it still works with things being out of focus. And I mean, it makes you as a reader at times kind of lust after answers, but realizing it ends up pointing you to what the real issues are. And I mean, I think my read of Roberta is like a little less pathologized than yours, in that like I think these girls end up pushing each other, and there's all this friction even in moments when they haven't pushed each other. And I mean, I think in trying to understand where she's coming from and why she lies about what happened, I think these girls just seem to like dig at each other in moments because of like a really painful past. But also, I mean, they are dealing with a moment in their childhood that was a long, long time ago at this point, that may be remembered through different lenses and different perspectives, kind of colored by the ways they've grown up too. That Roberta would insist that Maggie's black and Twyla not think that way may have to do with the ways that Roberta was dealing with race as a young person and that kind of thing. Like it's hard to say what each character knows in each moment and when they're trying to hurt each other and why. Sometimes there are clear tells, especially when it's Twyla who's been hurt. Like, one reason I see those first 3 sections as being a little mirrored is there's always this moment where Twyla just kind of goes after Roberta. And I think one thing I just wanted to say about that is, I think because we've been talking in this in StoryTalk so much about unreliable narrators, but also about when we're sympathetic to characters and when we aren't, I think going back to that early section and forming their friendship and bond, like, there isn't a moment where I look at one of these characters and I think, this is a character that I want to distance myself from, or that I don't care about, or that I'm writing off as a reader. I think I care deeply about both of these girls, and I think even when I don't know exactly where they're coming from, like, when they're hurting each other, there's this feeling that you're kind of like wishing that they could be better in those moments, and seeing the ways in which like they're not being themselves.
Yeah, I think it's a story that reminds me a little of Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping, and in that kind of like quietly painful way. I think, right, like I did not grow up in an environment this poor, but I always sort of feel reflexively on their behalf, like I have to say, like, nutrition is an important thing, but if mashed potatoes and hot dogs are Thanksgiving for you, good. That's like, amen. Like, if that's what you dig, that's what you dig, and that should be welcome, because in some ways it's this running away from a time that, Twyla notes early on is not so bad, that runs them into all these times that are so bad because they can't get past the image of that time or what it might have meant. And of course, like, there are things about that are unwelcome and shouldn't have been for those children, and that's not their fault, and that feels like such a bummer.
Yeah, I think also I got a little distracted talking about the 2 characters and got off track with Maggie, but it makes perfect sense to me that both of these characters would have guilt around Maggie, because they both are mean to her in the way that children can be. And of course, looking back and understanding that meanness, like they have guilt about it. They both call her names that we wouldn't call someone like Maggie as adults. They call her dummy. And Twyla notes that like it shames her to think back on it. And I mean, this is a moment where I think the perspective is brilliant. The line is, and it shamed me even now to think there was somebody in there, after all, who heard us call her those names and couldn't tell on us.
Yeah.
I think that was a moment where I was trying to pay attention to how Morrison was treating narration, and I looked at that and I thought, like, couldn't tell on us. That's such like little kid language. That's not an older person's way of thinking about that. But it's Morrison's way of, keeping us in the head and heart of that little girl, but also showing us that there is shame, there is that older understanding at the same time. It's a quick line, but it's very, very good, I think.
It's like the smothered faces that ties into the restaurant, but also allows the description of the hair that's going to be ambiguously neither black or white, but very 60s.
Oh, indeed.
Which he says, trying to transition to the fact that I think I read this story and it kind of floored me, and I think I anticipated this was going to be an emotionally difficult conversation. So I wanted to end on something that maybe was a little less so, or that was going to drag Matthew toward crankiness instead of sadness for these two little girls and these two troubled women. So the story is named a little cryptically after a French operatic term, recitatif, which refers to ordinary speech being sung. Because of my father's enthusiasm for opera, I have heard a lot of this, but the gist being something like, if you think about, sort of like The Music Man or musicals happening, usually there's the conversation and there's the song. A lot of operas don't do it that way. It's constant singing conversation, even when people are just chatting. So recitatif includes no opera, or if it does, it's just a reference to the classical music in the store, the grocery store, and it's not really about music per se, except the Jimi Hendrix thing comes up at that one time. Maybe Hey Joe is a version of singing ordinary speech. So why the choice to give this story this title?
First of all, I would like to say, for the record, that when you asked about the mirroring, I think if there's a mirroring between sections 2 and 4, or 2, 3, and 4, or whatever, it's a broken mirror. I don't think it's a straight mirror. Like it's jagged pieces of glass. That's how I'm viewing that, I guess.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But if it is a mirror, I think it's a mirror of you, the reader, looking at the book. The mirror is just directed right back at you. That's the mirror that I see.
Yeah.
And I think that's I don't have an answer for why it's called recitatif per se, other than that the opening thing you do is go, what the hell does that mean? Because I had to look it up. But the story is a questioning story, right? It poses questions even without asking questions.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's basically asking you to figure out what does the story mean? What is the story about? By asking a question immediately, what is it that I'm reading? So it asks you to go deeply into something that is not easy, that is emotionally difficult, that is both dense and not dense, that is about race, that is about growing up, that is about poverty and richness, right? All of these things, class, struggle, all of these things. And, I don't have like a great answer other than, right, I kind of, divided this into 5 sections, even as we talked about it.
Yeah.
And recently, I've been reading Milan Kundera's The Art of the Novel. And while this is not a novel, I think one of the things he says about music in it is really good. He says, each passage of a musical composition conveys an emotional expression. To compose a novel is to set different emotional spaces side by side. And so, I think that's what I was trying to get at earlier, looking at the 5 sections through Kundera's idea of time within, in this case, a story, right? The different emotional spheres that they put you in when they're up against each other. And like the story would be different if the ending was not so short.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant short ending after a really dense section in a really long section, right? It's just like the perfect like outro to this, to like leave that question, about Maggie hanging on the end of the story for the 2 characters, but also that question to you as the reader being like, all right, where do you stand? Or like, all right, is there any way, people can just get together and be people?
Yeah.
Right? And it's just like, what do I have to do? Beat you over the head? Get out this French word? Like, what in the fuck does it take for people to just like respect each other regardless of who they are?
Yeah. Shit.
Yeah, indeed. I'm glad you brought up Kundera because I think he thinks a lot about dividing up novels and also about music. I actually, saw it on the table here and was guessing at what you would be referencing. And many of his novels are divided into 7 sections, and he has a lot of like thinking around that and around pacing that I think is tremendously clever. I think reading this story twice, I was so much, piecing together plot that it was hard for me to step back and see the sections and, think of them in a way, think of them from a distance. I felt stymied by the title as well. I spent time kind of looking at the language to see, is this prose playing with song in some way or asserting itself that way? It seems like it is in places. One thing I noticed on the first couple pages, just paying attention to the line by line, is that there is a lot of repetition and sort of thoughts develop out of other thoughts. An example I can give is when Roberta's mother comes, she's described this way. She was bigger than any man, and on her chest was the biggest cross I'd ever seen. There are a lot of lines in the story like that, so that was a thought I had, but I think the more I sit with the title, the more I recognize that I haven't quite made sense of its meaning, but I think as I continue to think on it, I think it has to do probably for Morrison with structure.
Yeah.
And I actually would guess that there's one section in particular that is the Recitatif, and that actually maybe the opening is something like an overture in an opera, but I haven't spent enough time with that to say for sure, and I don't know operas very well, so that's just a hunch.
Yeah, I think it's been important to me to think about the way in which I understand that term working, and it's totally plausible that I've misunderstood that term as more about, right, like, and maybe my earlier example belies this a little bit, but rather than like speech bursting into song, but rather the song coming into sort of the cadence of speech while it's being sung, right? And I think that that's, I like the notion about these two girls having sort of musical life experiences being pulled into these moments of difficult and complex dialogue being sort of sung at that clip of the conversations of their lives.
Yeah, moments before talking, I was looking up this term in opera's terms.
Yeah.
And it does say that this is usually when a moment in an opera where like major plot points or dialogue gets conveyed. So it's kind of, not the most musical or artful section. It's driven by plot and dialogue, which, much of this story is.
One thing I just thought of was like, the world is the song, and this is like a section where we're like, talking back and forth, and like one day, like again, maybe we'll return to that song if we can find a way to get along.
On that note, folks, I hope you return to your songs sooner than later. Thank you for joining me today, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks for hosting us.